Tuesday Takeover on The Viewpoint. You are listening to Ngaba Mabece on SAFM.
Well, good evening to all the SAFM listeners, and welcome to The Viewpoint this Tuesday evening. I am Mielan Holeni. I am the Group Chief Advisor at Ndiso Consulting, and I'm your Tuesday Takeover until 9 p.m. I'll be in conversation with my guests, two of my guests here in studio and one guest online. Let me firstly introduce Mr. Alex Mabunda, who is the founder and Group Chief Executive Officer at Ndiso Consulting Group.
Good evening, Holeni.
And good friend of an associate of the industry, Mr. Zolani Zonyani, who is the chief editor as well of Municipal Edge. He's a governance expert and advisory and does a lot of great things to build the public sector. Welcome.
Evening, Mhlekazwam. Evening to our listeners this evening.
And someone who perhaps needs very little introduction because of the role that she has played in managing big finances, former city treasurer of the City of Johannesburg, as well as currently the head of Lanseria Smart City, Khumutso Letsatsi. Welcome, Khumutso.
Good evening, Milan, and good evening to your listeners.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I think this evening we will explore the profound influence of the budget allocations on economic growth and social development within South Africa, its cities, its district, and all the corners of the country. And departing from this, joined by these wonderful guests, we'll be talking across, the economics, the municipal governance, the finances, as we spearhead this discussion, and we'll leverage on all the insights of the experts that are here with us in studio as well as online. And talk about the 2023-2024 budget season that we are in, having started with the national budget, going into the provincial, now the local budgets are rolling out. So, ladies and gents, let's delve into it. To join us in conversation, please, you can call us on 086 000 2032. You can send us a voice note as well on 061 410 4107. X us as well on SAFM radio. So this is it. Let's talk, ladies and gentlemen. This year, I think, we're seeing a lot of oomph and excitement, or at least is it bravery, with regards to how the budgets, are being presented. And everyone tends to look forward, to having a budget, being read, to hear the numbers and sometimes to hear some of the projects that they've been waiting for a very long time. I'd like to kick off, by saying, look, the economy has not improved. We're sitting with constraints, we're sitting with global uncertainties, we're sitting with the difficulties of, lack of growth in our economy, where the projection is at 1.2% of GDP. So, how do you perceive this budget, the role of the budget and the allocations in how this can shape the South African economy? I think, starting with, the national picture, Mr. Zonyani, in terms of the provincial side, how would you characterize the role of a budget in shaping the economic trajectory of our country as well as its cities?
Thanks once more. A budget itself, it should be viewed as an instrument to solve some of the socio-economic challenges we have as a country. If we start with a national, that actually sets the scene in terms of its budgeting, followed by the province, as you say. It's more about scanning the environment, going to the planning, then allocating resources. And one of those resources being the budget. Now, the question becomes, as you do the scan, are you scanning the correct environment? Are you targeting the correct priorities? What informs your priorities? Are you bringing, I'll say, the citizens all the other stakeholders in the planning, because if you just allocate without that priority setting, that type of planning, you might be having resources in the form of a budget, but then are you addressing the real problem? Now, from the national to the province, then to municipalities, it becomes the issue of integration, collaborations, working together. Because in all honesty, all this budget ends up in a municipal space. There is no level above earth, that is province, above that one, that is national. All those resources go to a municipality. That's where all these socio-economic infrastructure, for an example, gets built to address all these socio-economic ills that we have. So that should be the genesis. But again, priority setting, planning, then allocating the budget together with other resources, because your human capital, your time that you need to allocate. It's through then that you'll be able to say, I am using the budget as an instrument to address these social and economic ills that we have as a country.
And of course, let me also bring in Khumutso as well. Having been a practitioner at local government, you mentioned that whatever happens, the budget, flows into the local space, onto the local ground, somewhere in South Africa. Currently, Khumutso, you are building a smart city, in Lanseria, and all about, running the coffers of a city. How would you characterize a budget, from building cities or building municipalities or building a district? What is the role of that budget in shaping their economic trajectory, as well as, the fiscal years and the MTREF and all of these terms that, tend to be complicated?
Thank you, Milan. I guess the points that have basically been made, I completely agree with them. It's always a balancing act. But the good thing about South Africa is that we have an amazing constitution that actually outlines and clearly outlines functional areas for each sphere of government, although we're all independent but interconnected basically in what we do. And specifically on the developmental mandate, from a budgeting point of view and planning process point of view, all three spheres of government must basically give priority to basic needs of communities, as well as promote social and economic development of those communities. And that was also enshrined in the white paper, specifically on local government, to actually change the material living conditions of the communities that those spheres of government basically serve. However, there's always limited resources and, of course, unlimited needs, but we do have serious challenges as a country. With a Gini coefficient of amongst the highest of around 0.63, it tells that majority of communities actually cannot even afford the services. And although we do have the free basic policies to address that part of community that can actually not be able to afford those services, it's always a balancing act between an operational budget and a capital budget. And even in a capital budget instance, you still have to find the balance between social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. But if you look at all the budgets and the messaging that has actually come through from the national budget as well, there's a lot of emphasis on infrastructure and closing the infrastructure backlog so we can unlock economic development, so that then all of these spheres of government can actually be financially sustainable to basically respond to the needs of communities.
Absolutely. And I think, Mr. Alex Mawunda, business is not a spectator when it comes to matters of budgets, when it comes to matters of finances, when it comes to matters of economic transformation as well as social transformation. How does the private sector view this whole budget allocations, as well as, how does as an instrument from a private sector point of view, as you running a business, how do you drive or use or see the budget becoming useful in driving imperatives within the economy?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Oleni. in business, we say that if you want to look at the strategic intent of an organization, look at their budget. So budgets on their own are an interpretation of the intentions of an organization. And of course, from a business point of view, we're always obviously looking at government, to create the necessary environment, for business to thrive. We want to see the infrastructure being developed. We want to see the governance processes happening, the permits, the approvals, and all of those kind of things that we are able to obviously, lodge in those economies or in those geographies and be able to provide the necessary services because, of course, as businesses, we are there to obviously, solve a need. We are serving communities, whether we are providing telecom services, banking services, and other related services that communities in general would want. So we are obviously jittery every time a budget is announced because that's, the time for us to understand whether our investments, will be protected, whether the budget will go to the necessary spaces that will, allow the economy, to thrive and the necessary environment that business must operate, to become, as it were. So budgets then becomes very, very important. But as I said in the opening, it's about the strategic intent. If you look at South Africa, we've got low growth, high unemployment, a whole lot of other social issues such as crime, and poverty. Those kind of indicators aren't very good for business. We want to see all of those issues being resolved. And when budgets are announced, whether it's at national, provincial, or even at local level, we are looking out, to those issues. Of course, again, a business such as Ndiso Consulting, we do business with government, and it's always important to understand where the expenditure is, where the intents are, so that we are able to align, our service, as it were, to support government in attaining those objectives.
So, and I think, the intent of a budget, in its widest sense, and taking into account, today, unemployment figures were released and they've risen to about 32.9%. We're seeing a lot of numbers. Inflation is stubbornly refusing to go down. There's the repo rate. We're still paying. At the highest. For instance, for of interest rates and so on. And coupled with that, I mentioned earlier the lack of growth. In our economy. How would you use a budget, to address, underlying structural impediments that would be contributing to this sort of stagnation, that would even hamper budgets, from growing to be able to help the economy? How would a budget, be used as an instrument in that sense?
Of course, it does go indeed to the strategic intent, but I think the one thing to be said, especially in the South African environment, the state spends a lot of money, in all of its programs, and the extent to which that rand goes further to give us, at the very least, the rand's value, worth of value, if I may put it that way, it's quite important. It's a problem if you allocate money to a program and at the end of the tenure of that program you have not achieved the results. So the issue of evaluating our programs, but not just evaluating, but most importantly, planning. We say in business, if you don't plan, you are planning to fail. And so, budgets then become effective when they've, first of all, aligned to a strategic intent, and there's a lot of planning to it. But not only that, the implementation part then becomes very, very important. I see, as I did indicate earlier, that some of the programs that we put money in, we don't quite get, what we've put the money for. So the issue of valuation and re-evaluating the programs that, we spend money on, it's also very, very important. But I must also say, you will know, for example, last year sometime Treasury issued a notice to ask state entities and government departments to cut on their expenditure. And I remember talking to a colleague, and they spoke about this whole thing of a haircut.
Taking a haircut.
Taking a haircut. So you don't want to take your haircut, with part of the hair going up and some of it going down because it doesn't look great. However, in such circumstances, you probably don't want to do that. you want to prioritize and sequence. And the reason why you have to prioritize is because there's a cause and effect kind of, type of effect, if I may say. Because if you prioritize, for example, areas that have got the multiply effect in economic growth, that will then allow you to then eventually increase your revenues and get out of the...
So let me bring in Zolani. In terms of the priorities, what is a good budget? If you say a budget, is one that is good, it's going to address the growth in the economy, it's going to deal with the social ills, as you mentioned. What characterizes a good budget? I mean, how do these allocations, or how do you even decide where to allocate this money?
It starts with the intention. Alex has mentioned a strategic intent. Now, a good budget in a context of South Africa, it should focus more on infrastructure development. And the situation we are in, we are not maintaining the infrastructure we have. We are expanding as a country. There is a lot of pressure in the infrastructure itself. What then that does in terms of, you talk about unemployment, infrastructure development in its nature, it will, as the infrastructure is developed, employment is created. But at the same time, you are unlocking other economies in a bigger scale. We spoke about industrialization earlier on. You can't talk of an industry if you haven't looked at what type of infrastructure is required. As a municipality, as provincial government and national government, how do we pool funding together? How do we plan jointly to ensure that that we want to achieve is achievable? But also another thing that we are still need to do a lot as a country. We talk infrastructure, but technology advancements. Because technology is the now, I normally hear people when we talk of fourth industrial revolution, it's like in 2030. Yet it was in previous years, and we are living it today. So those are some of the areas that if one looks at the budget, is it prioritizing infrastructure, both social and economic infrastructure, but most importantly, looking at the current developments. We talk, for an example, I'll say new economies. If you look at green economy, we speak a lot about oceans economy. The question will be, if you go to the budget, are you able to see an intent to invest in infrastructure that will then unlock those opportunities?
So, bringing you as well, Khumbudzo, how does a budget, how can a budget be utilized to unlock economic growth, whether in a local sense or whether in a provincial sense or at scale? How do you define a budget that unlocks economic growth?
I think it boils down to planning. I always say that South Africa doesn't necessarily have problem with money. If you look at just the size of our budgets on a consolidated basis, that it's a lot of money. But the challenge has always been being able to sustain a particular level, which I think back in the days when I was in local government, we always said at a bare minimum, at least 10% of the overall budget has to go to capital budget, the capex part of it. So it's not just predominantly operational budget, because it's the capital budget that basically unlocks development. But what we've basically seen, even though those allocations are made, and especially the biggest metros, they do strive to even have skin in the game where their own revenue is basically allocated to capital budget, and we've seen it from the likes of Cape Town, City of Tshwane, I guess, back in the days, and City of Johannesburg, where they would maintain a particular level. But the problem has always been the project preparation part of it, the conceptualization of projects and programs and the planning around them to have high impact in terms of the implementation of those projects. So I guess it's just the balancing on the allocation part of it, where we have seen that has happened in the metros in the main. But where does the money actually go? Absolutely. And what does that money actually buy us at the end of the day from an economic development point of view, where we're able to crowd in private sector and basically stretch the rent?
So when we come back from the break, I'd like us to go deeper as well into this whole notion of how economic growth can be unlocked, as well as how that can translate into improving the lives of people. So after the break, we're going to take an ad break. If you'd like to get in touch with us, phone us on 086 000 2032. Send a voice note if you wish on 061 410 4107. We'll talk on the other side.
Tuesday Takeover on The Viewpoint. You are listening to Nqaba Mabece on SAFM.
Well, I'm Mielan Holeni, and I'm your Tuesday Takeover. I'm impersonating the legend here. So, continuing, before the ad break, we were talking about unlocking economic growth using the budget. But in all of this, we talk big numbers. I'm looking at some of the numbers of the consolidated government expenditure for 2024, 2025, 2.37 trillion. The social services budget, about 1.41 trillion. Does any of these big numbers that are being mentioned, how far do they go? And can we trace, how they are changing people's lives? Starting with you, Zolani, how does a budget impact people's lives, or how should it impact people's lives on the ground?
One of the challenges we have as a country, it goes to planning, and both my colleagues have touched on that. Because if you don't involve, I would say, one of the three layers, because when I categorize government, we've got us as citizens. That involves any other stakeholder that exists. We've got the public representatives. Then we've got administration. Now, if the other two spheres, which is administration and public representatives, will then live out in the planning phase the critical stakeholder, which is the citizen, the business, you can name them. That's where you get the prioritization right, because you get to know and understand these are the needs of the people. Then how do you respond to that? As I've indicated earlier on, you use the budget as an instrument, but even before budgeting, you talk planning. Before planning, you scan the environment to check what is the status quo and how do I respond to the status quo. You can trace the budget specifically in the context of South Africa, because our budget, specifically nationally and provincially, is the most transparent. For a number of years, we've been number one, number two in terms of the international survey that gets conducted. The question is, you and me, how do we then interact with those documents? How do we go and navigate and establish where is this budget going? That's the missing element that I think we really need to stand up and influence how the budget is allocated. Is it really changing the lives? And I think you and me can easily answer that question and say no, maybe for the few. How do we respond to those poor ones in terms of catering for their needs?
Let me take Khumutso before we take callers. Khumutso, economic transformation and social transformation. Most of the budgets, you've presided on many a budget. Where have you seen, or how have you seen that budget transforming a community? I mean, you've said, with one of the biggest, cities in Africa, so your views in terms of how this budget goes or filters down to the ground where such that it impacts a life.
Mielani, sometimes I really think that we're really hard on ourselves, and especially given where we started in the past 30 years. We really came from a very low base. And you don't need to look very far other than the Stats SA non-financial reports that actually really account for where the money has actually been. And I'll just quote just a few stats. The fact that about 94.7% of South Africans have got access to electricity, I know we do have a challenge at this point in time, but the infrastructure, it means the infrastructure has been built. The fact that we've got over 82.4% of South Africans having piped water. they have it because the infrastructure has been built. Unfortunately, because the infrastructure for public sector is generally bulked to basically just anchor development or catalyze development, we actually don't tend to see it. Of course, when the traffic lights don't work, there's potholes, that part of infrastructure we basically see, but majority of the infrastructure is actually underground. And a lot of investment has basically been made over the years to make sure that the basic services are actually provided to South Africans. There's certainly room for improvement in terms of maintaining the infrastructure and accommodating for natural growth.
Absolutely.
And also just having that balancing act between social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. But certainly if we maintained our infrastructure, we do have world-class infrastructure in South Africa.
Thank you. So let me go to the callers. We have Raisa Kunwana phoning us from the Northwest. Welcome, Raisa.
Hi, Miyala, my brother and your guest.
Welcome.
Even my brother. I've got a question. So my question is there a possibility of that we can curb the issue of wasteful and unfruitful expenditure? That is the first question. How can we play around in curbing that kind of stuff? And then the second one is, can we not reduce the squandering of money by insourcing all the services which you go to consultants and end up and just scrap the tender issues and insource those skills into the government so that we don't lose money in consultants and tenders? That is Raisa Mudikanya. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you very much. I will allow my guest Alex to answer that one.
Yeah, and I mean, fruitless and wasteful expenditure, indeed, that's a serious problem in government. But of course, this matter has to be put into context because, when the AG put up the report and they report on these expenditure patterns, sometimes the lack of detail might, give a very bad impression of how money is spent in government. For all I know is that generally public officers try as much as possible, to implement the programs of government. Of course, government is highly regulated. There's a lot of rules that are supposed to be observed there, whether it's procurement, budgeting, and so forth. And when some of those rules, because of other exogenous constraints, are not followed to the T. I mean, a simple thing where a tender was advertised for less than, a prescribed number of days, or, it went past, the days that are prescribed. Such can also fall into that category, of evaluation by the AG. So, but having said that, of course, you do have cases where there's just blatant, misappropriation of government funds. But I think we do need to also consider that it's not always the case. Regarding consultants and tenders and so forth, look, I know this has been a rallying cry, but I think what people do need to understand is that, we're running modern economies that requires a lot of skills, that government at times doesn't have the necessary resources and even just brand, so to speak, especially in South Africa, to attract such skills. You will barely find, for example, people in government who can execute certain type of projects. Those skills are sitting in the private sector, and if you don't work with the private sector, you will not be able to implement anything. What we must guard against is a situation whereby tenders and consultants are misused in government, and I think that is something that to be looked at.
So let me also take back to the callers. Kandisa from Matlosana, welcome to the Viewpoint on Tuesday Takeover.
Good evening, my brother, and your guest there.
Good evening to you and your question.
My brother, I just wanted to know from your guest, what can be done? You get the municipality always is having an unfunded budget. And you realize that they have credit, they owe some ESCOM, water. And when you check public participation, as you do IDP, most of municipality now, they don't do any public participation. We don't know why we're supposed to approve that budget will never be participated into it. But my question is, when Auditor General gets that the financial statements they are not corresponding to each other, what can be done to assist those money? Because the provincial finance department, I don't know why they used to bring intervention, because as they bring Section 139, I don't know if it's C or it's B, but in finance, those people, they don't assist municipalities.
Okay.
They just come and loot here, do other things. And at the end of the day, service delivery is not going to people.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kandisa.
Now, I wanted to know about unfunded budget. How can we assist these municipalities? Because at the end of the day, we want progress in municipalities. Thank you.
Khumutso, unfunded budgets. I think sitting as the city's treasurer, Kandisa wants to know.
Okay. No, certainly. So on the issue around unfunded budget, I mean, it boils down to oversight committees, councils, and basically MPECs. There's a process in terms of budgeting that's outlined in terms of the MFMA. And once the municipality basically puts together the budgets, before council can actually approve the budget, they go through a budget benchmarking process, basically with National Treasury. Of course, municipalities, being an independent sphere of government, sometimes they would go against the advice that they're given by other spheres of government. And that's why you have seen that over the years, there's basically been a deterioration in the state of local government finances, and there's a growth in that particular respect. And the origin of that problem is those municipalities that consistently pass budgets that are basically unfunded. There is specifically a program that I know that COGTA is currently undertaking and running to assist about 163 municipalities between COGTA and National Treasury in resolving that particular issue and basically restating those budgets over time. But there's another challenge that we actually don't talk about, where communities really need to come to the party in paying for the services that communities basically consume, those households that actually can afford. So the debtors book of municipalities at a consolidated level, I mean, we're talking about over 400 billion of outstanding debtors. Can you imagine if the communities were disciplined to pay for those services, what that would do to unlock economic infrastructure? And then we don't have to have issues in terms of crowding in private sector investment and actually making sure that we efficiently deliver on services. Thanks.
So unfunded budgets, very shortly before we take news, in 30 seconds.
Unfunded budgets come in so many ways. Firstly, capacity becomes one of, I'll say, the challenging points in our system. We've got also a challenge of unfunded mandates, where a national or a provincial responsibility ends up in a municipality without the funding to actually support that initiative. But what also becomes important, what came from Ukandani, is in approving unfunded budget as a councillor, you must ask yourself, am I doing the right thing by approving a budget that is going to fail? Ideally, no council should be approving an unfunded budget.
Absolutely. We'll be taking news shortly. And my name is Mielan Holeni. I'm your host to this evening on the Tuesday Takeover. And my guests are Alex Mabunda, Zolani Zonyani, as well as Khumutso Letsatsi. We'll wrap up on our discussion when we come back after the news. We'll be taking news right away.
SAFM 104 to 107 nationwide. Leading the The Viewpoint, weekdays 8 to 10 p.m. on SAFM. You are listening to Nqaba Mabece on SAFM.
Good evening, SAFM. SAFM I wish one day could have a president who will wake up and say, I am no more employing people because they were in the trenches during the struggle, this cadre deployment. If we can employ people like these guests tonight, people who can take this country far, think tanks, South Africa is rich with brains, but the country is ailing because of cadre deployment. Rewarding those who are in the trenches, the country is burning. Why not abandon cadre deployment and employ capable people like our guest tonight? I wish that day could come. Norman from Brixton.
Thank you, Norman. I think the country is ailing, gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, I must say. Where to from now on? We've talked about, the budget as an instrument. We've talked about the budget as a transformative tool, as for social change and all of that. But what is it that needs to be done, and how would you advise the practitioners who are coming up with these lofty budgets? Starting with Alex Mabunda.
Thank you, Mr. Olin. And also to the voice note, we agree. Yeah, so look, I think as a country we do need something along the lines of an economic development war room where we strategize around economic infrastructure, that deals with issues around energy, water, transport, and of course the digital infrastructure. And alongside that also then come in with the issue of industrialization where we pick winners, to industrialize around. I won't go into details, but we know that we've got endowments in certain key areas around metals, around tourism, and technological innovation that we can position South Africa as an industrial hub using those gifts that we have as a country, and then all have that strategy, proliferated through your national, provincial, and local governments, so that we have one plan for restoration of this economy. Thank you.
Zolani, how do we stop, how does the budget stop the country from ailing?
It goes back to the previous caller, the issue of people and capacity, and we can link that back to the National Development Plan. One of the questions we need to answer, are we doing enough? Have we done enough to build the state capacity? And few critical things. Firstly, connecting local government, provincial government, and national government for them to work together in a more integrated manner, collaborate and form or establish those partnerships. But most importantly, I spoke earlier on about, I would say, three tiers. Ourselves as citizens, the public representatives, and the administrators. How do we then bring those stakeholders together so that as we talk about planning, budgeting, it's basically informed by what is really a need on the ground. That's basically how we can manage to solve some of our problems.
Well, I think it has been a wonderful show this evening, talking about the budget, using the budget as an instrument and budget, for change. But, at the end of the day, we've spoken about, big numbers. But how can these numbers be translated into reality as well as impact? I think our experts have answered the questions in many different ways. And thank you for some of the compliments. I think it was from Norman that you have think tanks. I'm just facilitating all these think tanks. And this is the Takeover Show. I'm Mielan Holeni. Thank you to my guest, Alex Mabunda, Zonyani, as well as Kumutso Letsatsi. Unfortunately, she has fallen off. But we collectively thank the listeners for participating on this show and hoping that, as the future budgets are apportioned, they will drive economic growth and they will drive social transformation. Thank you very much, Ngaba, for welcoming us into this show. One thing, of course, I'm a fast learner, so demonstrating by learning. But it's been wonderful. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for honoring the platform with the depth and quality of engagement. I certainly would want to now actually take the conversation forward and actually probe some of those issues with you, actually, or whoever you think might drive the conversation forward. Because one thing, and I'm just going to sort of even move deeper into it because I'm a procurement guy, people miss the strength of government, even with what little social power it has. When I say social power in terms of structural economy and sort of the relationships it is forced to consider when it makes decisions and holding certain things accountable a certain way. Forget all of that. But even the strength of government's public procurement system,
the muscle of government to
when
buy.
deployed right, what propensity it has to effect meaningful change. In other words, as the frameworks exist today, don't change any law, don't do anything to the books. Just take that money, make it do what it is intended to do within the existing frameworks as they are, and see the change using the right people for the right purpose.
Absolutely.
It really is untold. The almost immediate impact, I would say, that money could make. I mean, we're talking about a nearly R1 trillion enterprise, public procurement in South Africa. 10% of which on average is oftentimes lost to irregular and wasteful expenditure, all of that. Nonetheless, Mhlekazwam, thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate it. To the listeners, thank you so much. This was thoroughly engaging, and I promise you we'll engage this last point